Now, the talk is on Nazism or National Socialism and Communism, the two forms of full socialism. So it's on politics, and I'm going to do something that's rarely done in political discourse. I'm actually going to define my terms. Well, what a concept, right? Because politics, as you know, is often filled with mushy, woozy terms. You get American politicians, this great democracy of ours, they'll say, there's not one person in 100, maybe not one in 1,000, who knows, one, what a democracy is, and two, thank God that the United States is not a democracy, right? It's a constitutional republic. So yeah, I'm going to define terms. And also, we're talking about two versions of totalitarian state, two versions of collectivist dictatorship, National Socialism and communism. So we need to discuss the antipode also, individual rights and capitalism. But also, I just want to point out before we get started, I rarely use the term Nazism. Nazi is a contraction for National Socialist or National Socialism. And if we use the right name, the full name, it helps indicate to people that this is a form of socialism. The only good thing we could say about National Socialism is it's well named. It's accurately named. And the great Chinese philosopher Confucius said a long time ago that the beginning of wisdom is to see to it that things are called by their right names. Okay, so let's define some terms. Here, I'm well known as an objectivist intellectual. I'm a big admirer of Ayn Rand, and she defines. And everybody, if you haven't read Ayn Rand's books, I strongly recommend The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged, preeminently. But capitalism is the system of individual rights, including property rights, in which all property is privately owned. The key point here, as the antipode or opposite to these collectivist dictatorships, is that capitalism is the system of individual rights. To put it simply, your life belongs to you. It does not belong to the state. And the right to your own life in both the moral sphere and in the economic sphere. So I think the most fundamental aspect of that right, and one that's under fire today, is freedom of speech. When we see, the administration establishing, what did they call it, a division of disinformation at the Department of Homeland Security. George Orwell in 1984 had a better name for it. He called it the Ministry of Truth. And that is terrifying, that improperly the government has no say, no business, no say in the truth-falsity business, right? None. Truth and falsity is not determined by the government. And by the way, DHS, Homeland Security, that's a law enforcement agency. So if you or I, put forth theories that they deem disinformation, does that mean federal agents with guns show up at our doors and arrest us? I mean, that's the direction. That's certainly the direction in which we're heading. Freedom of speech, individual rights. I think the single most important right here is freedom of speech. That's because what that means is freedom of the mind, freedom of intellectual expression. And we disagree on all kinds of issues. Let's say, climate change, as one controversial topic. Everybody puts forth their evidence, right? I mean, I've taught logic for 40 years, and I, tell my students over and over and over again, these issues are decided by evidence, not by who says it, not by what their academic pedigree is, not by what work they've done in the past. The issue is decided by evidence, and did I say evidence? And with freedom of intellectual expression, everybody is free to put forth the evidence, and then rational individuals look at the evidence and they judge what conclusion has the evidence to support it. This is the way we arrive at truth. This is the way we refute error. We don't fight falsehood with suppression. We fight falsehood with truth. Right? We don't fight irrationality with suppression. We fight irrationality with rationality. We don't fight disinformation with suppression. We fight disinformation with information. Right, so this is a hallmark of capitalism. By the way, the proper name for this system is liberalism. It's the way it's known in some parts of the world, and it's the proper name. the LIB root, liberty, the support of liberty, meaning of individual rights. So capitalism is and a lot of people don't realize it, is a Marxist name. Depending on who you read, Marx either coined the term or some earlier socialist did, but at the very least Marx popularized it. And you can see, what does that mean? Capitalism, to Marx, that means it's the system in which the men of capital, the men of wealth, have the economic and political power to legally persecute the poor, and the working class. The essentials of Marxism, of class, inherent inveterate class warfare, is packed into the very name. It's a Marxist term. The proper name for the system of individual rights is liberalism. So the system of liberty, freedom of speech, and James Madison was, he's been canceled, right? He was a slave owner. Well, not in Virginia anymore. Anyway, we're in Maryland. But James Madison was a slave owner, and we properly condemn him for that. But he also did a lot of great things in his career. Lead author of the U.S. Constitution, virtually the sole author of the Bill of Rights. Freedom of religion, right there in the First Amendment. Most people don't even know that. My students just look at me. First of all, they don't know who James Madison was. College kids, American college kids, never heard. Half my class never heard of James Madison. It's really sad. It's a statement. They don't teach American history much anymore, and to the extent they do, they use Howard Zinn, People's History of the United States, written by communists, literally, he's a member of the Communist Party. But First Amendment, if the students know that as the freedom of speech amendment, that's excellent. But very few people know that that's the freedom of religion. All right, the first sentence of the First Amendment states, quote, Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion, comma, or restricting the free exercise thereof. That was a revolution in 1790. It's a revolution to this day, right? I said, don't try this at home. We'll fly to Syria. We'll tell our good friends at ISIS, I'm so glad to see you guys are so intoxicated with God. You're so religious. You love God so much. That's great. Freedom of religion forever, boys, right? So, it was God is commenting on this. But I asked the students, what'll the boys at ISIS tell me when I say that? And when one kid looked at me and said, what'll ISIS say to you, Dr. Bernstein? You mean before or after they chop off your ass? Which, of course, is sadly true. Freedom of religion was not just revolutionary in 1790; it's revolutionary today. So these are some of the aspects of individual rights. Your life belongs to you. The freedom of the press, freedom of peaceful assembly. Like this freedom to start your own, to earn and to own property, freedom to start your own company, to retain any profits that you make from the company, so on and so forth. All of this is an aspect of individual rights that your life belongs to you. Now, socialism, properly conceived, socialism is the system in which an individual's life is socialized. It does not belong to the individual anymore. It belongs to society. It belongs to the state. And I think that's a good way to explain socialism. Socialism is the system in which your life, an individual's life, is socialized. Your life belongs to society, not to the state. This is in full socialism. There are all kinds of mixed economies. The United States is one. Scandinavia is another one. We'll get to that in a little while. But and here historically and philosophically, the leading influence was the enormously influential German philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, 1770 to 1831, post-Kantian German philosopher, state worshiper. Literally, his politics is known as state worship. And I had a professor in grad school who used to say, if you really want to understand the philosopher, you got to know who his philosophic enemies are. And that's an interesting point, because you need, first, foremost, and always, you need to know what a philosopher stands for. But it's helpful to know what and who the philosopher is against. And Hegel's political philosophy, of course, is directed against the Lockean, Jeffersonian tradition of individual rights, the Anglo-American system of individual rights. And Hegel is the preeminent philosopher of the Germanic approach to political philosophy, and as the state comes first, foremost, and always. The state is preeminent, and individual subordinate to the state, and an individual owes. Hegel puts it very nicely in his work on politics. If you ever read Hegel, you know, or tried to read Hegel, you know his main work, the phenomenology of mind, is impenetrable. I mean, it makes Kant look like Beetle Bailey by comparison. But in his work on politics, the philosophy of right, it's actually intelligible. I mean, you could understand it. And he says this, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but he says in so many words, you know, that, first of all, that individuals do not have rights. We have obligations, no rights. We have obligations to the state. The state, this is obviously directed against Locke, you know, and Jefferson and the Anglo-American school of political philosophy. And Hegel goes on to say in the philosophy of right, in so many words, that if the state calls upon me to surrender my life, then I am morally obligated to do so. I mean, this is like open season on individuals. Anybody that the state deems unworthy, or somebody the state deems dangerous or unworthy of life, the state has the moral right to terminate my life, your life, any individual's life. So now the prime examples of this, of course, are National Socialism, Fascist Italy, the Soviet Union, North Korea, systems like that. Full totalitarianism, which we're going to discuss, or full collectivist dictatorships, which we're going to discuss today. But again, full socialism means your life belongs to society as a whole. The state comes first. That's, you know, if you read Hegel, the society or the state is always capitalized. I often thought that if there were no uppercase letters on Hegel's typewriter, his whole political philosophy would have collapsed. But the state, the state is the march of God through history, he says. That's a quote. Now, I'm not sure what that means, but I know it sounds scary. The state is the march of God through history. No, what does that mean? Does that mean in some sense that the state is divine? Yeah, I think for Hegel it does. He is literally known as a state worshiper in the history of political philosophy. Does that mean in some sense the state is infallible? Yeah, I think for Hegel it does. And so Hegel dies in 1831. He's a very popular lecturer in the German universities, University of Vienna, which is where Marx attended college, at least for a while. He's very popular, drew students from all over Deutschland. Another German philosopher at the time, Arthur Schopenhauer, according to legend, he was asked the administration to schedule his lectures at another time because he didn't want to have to compete with Hegel. So you know, it's an interesting point here. This is how the universities are how philosophy. The universities are the conduit by means of which philosophy is transmitted into the intellectual culture. I think that Hegel wrote that conduit for him. You know, these abstruse philosophic theories. But you know, Germany is known as the land of poets and philosophers. In fact, I don't want to, you know, I'm going to be bashing German philosophy here, so let me make, I don't want to sound like a bigot here. Germany is one of the most advanced cultures in the history of the world, and there's no denying it. Right? I mean, there isn't a field of intellectual endeavor in which German intellectuals have not excelled. From architecture to zoology, A to Z, anything in between, music, obviously, literature, Goethe, Schiller, you know, great writers. German engineering is even is a cliche. But German philosophy is a disaster. German philosophy is just horrendous, and has been terribly destructive, you know, in the world. And so Hegel dies 1831. Marx's dates 1818 to 1883. Marx lives right through the middle of the 19th century. German, a PhD in philosophy, goes to the University of Vienna for a while, where Hegel had taught for many years, and Hegel's influence was strong. And we see Germany moving through the 19th and into the 20th century towards National Socialism and via Marx through to communism. But before we get to the National Socialists and the communists, let's discuss briefly the mixed economy. Now, what the so-called mixed economy is a farrago of clashing elements. It's just a confused mixture of part individual rights and part of sacrifice to the state, part freedom, part dictatorship. And look at the examples. You know, people. There's so much confusion in politics. You'll often hear people talk about Scandinavia as though those countries are socialist. And they'll talk about the United States as if it's capitalist. You know, sometimes I don't know. No. They're all mixed economies. So you could look at some of the examples. They're all mixed economies. So let's take Sweden for example, which is the largest, I think, of the Scandinavian economies. There's a great deal of individual rights in Sweden. I don't think the Swedes have a constitutional amendment, upholding freedom of speech, but there's a lot of, by permission, by privilege, there's a lot of free speech that's allowed. You're not going to get incarcerated in Sweden for criticizing the government in many cases, or standing up for individual rights and being an Iron Man supporter. There's freedom of religion. The borders are open. You don't get shot if you try to emigrate from Sweden. There's a lot of individual rights in that regard, and in the economic sphere. IKEA is privately owned and operated for profit. Volvo is privately owned and operated for profit. Saab is privately owned and operated for profit. Ericsson is privately owned and operated for profit. You walk down the streets of Stockholm, all these stores and shops, butcher, baker, candlestick maker, they're all privately owned and operated for profit. So, there's a great deal of individual rights in these Scandinavian countries. There's a good deal of, there's a massive taxation. There's a large welfare state. The state has an enormous amount of power in different areas. But full socialism, no. It's not National Socialism. It's not communism. It's a mixed economy. It's a lot of individual rights there. And the United States, the United States was largely a capitalist system 100 years ago, late 19th. Turn of the 20th century, but today, no, it's almost as much of a mixed economy as the Scandinavian countries. The most egregious examples of the socialist elements in the American mixed economy is the goddamn government school system, which is an unconscionable evil, which gets students, I'm tempted to say victims, which gets its victims by force, by compulsory education, gets money by force, by taxation. It taxes parents. A lot of parents, their taxes, their property tax, their income tax, their sales taxes go to finance the government school system. By the way, see to it that things are called by their right names. The euphemism is public schools. Any private school is open to the public. These are government schools. Right? See to it that things are called by their right names. They're owned, they're operated by the government, they're funded by force by the government, and close to 90% of American school kids go to the government schools, which are controlled by what Arthur Bester, American historian, wrote a book, Educational Wastelands, in the 1950s. He spoke of what he called the interlocking director. Who holds the power of the government school system? And he pointed out, one, the teachers' colleges or schools of education. Two, the state departments of education. Three, the federal department of education. This is the interlocking director. This is who holds the power in the school system, and they dictate the curriculum. And the curriculum has increasingly become, over the last 100 years, less phonics to teach reading, so more remedial reading problems, less American history. Social studies replaced history 100 years ago. Less history and more communist propaganda, especially in the form of Howard Zinn's book, and so on and so forth. And you get these college kids, and as a college professor, I inherit the products of the school system. And these are good kids. These are good American kids. But some of them struggle just with the mechanics of reading. This is college. They struggle in some cases, not all, but some cases, just with the mechanics of reading, never mind with reading comprehension. And my math colleagues, not surprisingly, tell me the same thing. We have to do remedial work with the kids in math. So it's less and less academic training, more and more propaganda. The government school system is a very good example of socialism, socialist elements in America. The welfare state, of course, is the socialization of the charity industry. The Federal Reserve System is the socialization of the money supply. The school system is the socialization of education, in this country, and so on and so forth. So the United States is not a capitalist system. It hasn't been for 100 years. It's a mixed economy. I don't know how much different it is than the Scandinavian countries at this point. Maybe we have slightly more capitalist elements than the Scandinavian countries do. Maybe they have slightly more socialist elements than we do, but it's very, very close at this point. They're all mixed economies. All right. You ready for this cheery topic of National Socialism and Communism? Yes. Well, that's the topic. So this I'm using here. A lot of people here probably know my good friend Jonathan Honig, who's Ayn Rand had started a textbook of Americanism, and she hadn't finished it. And Jonathan Honig got the rights from her student and literary executive, Dr. Leonard Peikoff, and finished this a few years ago, a new textbook of Americanism. And so I'm reading here from my essay, not reading it, I'll just discuss it, my essay here on freedom and dictatorship. And Ayn Rand had asked a whole bunch of questions that she wanted to answer in her textbook of Americanism. Some she answered herself, and some, when Jonathan got the rights from Leonard Peikoff, he hired scholars to answer. And one of the questions that Ayn Rand asked is there any difference between communism and fascism? And I said, yes, there is. They are variations on a theme. They are two forms of collectivist political systems. So, since I have this funny idea that we should define terms, we'll define what collectivism is. The collective just means group, right? You're looking at me like I just landed from Pluto. But yeah, it does. Collective means group. Doing things together as one. So collectivism means the primacy of the group over the individual. So collectivism, political theory claiming that an individual's life belongs not to the individual, but to the collective or the group. Whether the group is the race, which is the National Socialist version, the working class, which is the communist version, or some such thing. So collectivism utterly repudiates the moral principle of individual rights. So because of this, collectivism is a form of totalitarianism. And again, totalitarian, one thing we could say for totalitarianism, the only positive thing, is the name is accurate, right? Total state. It's the total state. The state has total power, life and death power, over each individual citizen. It's funny, the timing here, because I've just recently, I'm a bookworm, just recently I've been rereading George Orwell's 1984. And I read it a long time ago, and I'm not just rereading it now, and I'm impressed. Orwell really gets it right of what a totalitarian state is. And in addition to reading or rereading Ayn Rand's books, I strongly recommend everybody to read or reread 1984, what the total state looks like. No individual rights. The state's power over an individual is total life and death power, just as Hegel said. The state possesses the moral and the legal authority to dispose of an individual's life as it sees fit. It can kill you for whatever reason it wants. Maybe they don't agree with your religious views, or they don't agree with your political views, or your grandfather was revolutionary, or whatever. So, politically, the National Socialists, and fascism more broadly, to include the Italian variety, notice the name, National Socialism. That's right, that's accurate. The National Socialists are nationalists who claim two things. One, their nation is superior, and it has the moral right to conquer, enslave, or exterminate the inferior peoples of other nations. And two, the nation, the state as a whole, has moral and legal supremacy over its own citizens whose lives belong to it. Deutschland über alles. Have you know any German?
Ambition.
What does that mean?
Deutschland means
Germany over
German.
everything.
Yeah, Germany, yeah, right. You say, Jack?
Deutschland means German. I don't know what the über alles means.
Oh, Uber means over,
Germany
right?
overall.
Yeah,
Thank you.
right, yeah. Germany overall. And that has two aspects to its meaning, right? Because one, it means that Germany is the master race and has a manifest destiny to conquer all of Europe, if not all of the world, and impose brutal rule of enslaving and or annihilating the inferior races. But also it means the German state over the German individual. Internationally, it means Germany's right to conquer the world, and domestically, it means the primacy of the German state over the German individual. By the way, this is why it's so. I think in Europe, you're from Europe, I take it.
No,
Oh, I'm sorry, you're American.
Ohio.
That's America, isn't it?
Last time I checked.
Yeah, I went to the government school, so my geography may be a little weak. But I was, in Europe, I think this is better known than in America. And it's really shocking and inspiring in a way. And that is the story of the White Rose. You guys familiar with the White Rose? These were German kids, Aryans, in the German sense. So they were safe medical students. So Hans Scholl, Sophie Scholl. They launched the resistance movement to the Nazis, 1942, 1943. They distributed leaflets. It was in Munich, the belly of the beast, where National Socialism was birthed. It was most powerful. They were distributing leaflets. You can see what these leaflets say. Hitler's a lie. Everything that comes out of Hitler's mouth is a lie. National Socialism is evil. They're murdering Jews. They're murdering innocent civilians. These people are a disgrace to Germany. I mean, they had to know the way it would end, and it did. Eventually, they were caught by the Gestapo, and they were a sham trial. They weren't allowed to speak in their own defense, and they were executed. How did the Nazis execute them? They guillotined them. According to the story, with Hans Scholl, just as the blade was about to come down, Hans Scholl, who was like 21, long live freedom or something like that. And he cried out before they chopped off his head. These were kids, early 20s, late teens. They would have been safe if they kept their head down. They were Aryans, at least to the Nazis, whatever that meant. But these were real heroes. I mean, talk about courage above and beyond the call of duty, right in Nazi Germany, to stand up for freedom. They really inspire us. They show us people aren't all monsters. There are real heroes and heroines amongst us. Anyhow, so National Socialism, nationalism is a big part of this in both of the meanings. And notice that the National Socialist version was distinctively racist, as we know, the Aryan race. If you read Mein Kampf, Hitler's book, Hitler. And it's interesting in Mein Kampf, Hitler does not claim physical superiority. He recognizes that other races have physical specimens. Nor does he claim intellectual superiority. He recognizes that there are geniuses in other races. He claims moral superiority. Claims that several things. One, amongst the Aryans, is the most highly developed willingness for the individual to sacrifice himself for the state, right? for the folk, right? For the people. So that self-sacrifice is most highly developed in the Germanic culture, in the Germanic peoples, he says. And Kant had emphasized this, and duty, do your duty, anti-egoism, anti-self-interest ethics that Kant articulated. Hegel, of course, developed that into a full-blown political theory. Do your duty to the state, do your selfless service to the state. So Hitler claims the most highly cultivated form of self-sacrifice is in Aryan culture, and of course demonizes the Jews because he says the Jews are purely egoistic. There's no cultivated sense of self-sacrifice, and so on. But the second key point here is that the Nazis claim a biological basis to this moral superiority. You know, we could dispute whether self-sacrifice is more highly developed in German culture, or is it? And above all, we could dispute whether it's good or not. Right? Even if it is highly developed in the German culture, we could dispute whether that. We could certainly challenge whether or not that's good. But the second point is, it's biologically rooted. It's in the blood and the bowels. We gotta love the imagery here. It's visceral. You know, how do we know our moral superiority? It's just in our guts. We know it in our blood and our bowels. We just feel it. But it's biologically based. What a mess! What a mess this is. First of all, it contradicts everything we know about genetics. You know, moral characteristics are acquired characteristics. They can't be transmitted. Mom and dad might be moral paragons. Junior might be a criminal. Or vice versa. Mom and dad might be criminals. Junior might be a moral paragon. There's no biological basis for moral characteristics. There's no way for them to be genetically transmitted. So the Nazis had a simple solution to that problem. They rewrote the biology textbooks. Oh, it's good to be the king, right? They rewrote the biology textbooks to say that you could transmit biological moral characteristics biologically. That's one problem. But also, then, how do we know this? Since it contradicts the whole science of genetics, which by 1930s we knew something about it. We just feel it. It's just a visceral feeling. It's just a sensation in our blood and our bowels. So it's completely subjective. It's a completely subjective epistemology. It's a completely subjective attempt to. There's no proof. We just feel it. Oh, the whole theory. What a mess. It's just astonishing, isn't it? Germany is such an advanced culture, and this like childlike theory, this ridiculous theory, becomes so popular in Germany. It's truly a tragedy. Now, I want to point out, the claim of national superiority that all National Socialists claim, or all fascists claim, does not require racism. You could just claim national superiority as a culture. Our culture is superior to yours, and that makes us better than you, and we can conquer you and do whatever we want. The Nazis had a biological or racial basis to it. Okay, so the National Socialists are National Socialists. That's absolutely right. Now the Communists, on the other hand, are internationalists. They're international socialists. The Communists interpret history and current events not as a conflict amongst nations or races, but as a class struggle between the working class and the owning class. So the international working class must rise up in revolution and triumph over the oppressive international owning class. An example of the difference regarding World War II was the National Socialists viewed the world's fundamental political conflict as a national struggle between, in part, Germany and Britain. The Communists, on the other hand, interpreted it as an international struggle between, on one side, the German and British working classes, and on the other side, the German and British owning classes. So the warring factions for the Communists, the warring factions on each side were composed of worldwide economic classes, the identities of which superseded nationality. Now you see why National Socialism, it's really interesting, isn't it? That the Communists claim, we're for the little guy, we're for the working man, we're for the oppressed, poor, downtrodden poor, and yet Communism is Marxism, as mistaken as it is a philosophical theory. It takes it's an abstraction to think of an international working class and an international owning class. You see what? It appeals to the intelligentsia and nobody else. The working class very rarely has any sympathy for once in a while, the working class very rarely has any sympathy for Marxism or communism. But fascism and National Socialism, that'll sometimes galvanize the lower classes because it's a lot of it's racial. You can actually see at a perceptual level. You can observe who your enemies are, who the other tribe is, and it's easy to hate them. And National Socialism will sweep the gutters of any racist of any kind. The theory's at a very gut level, observational, perceptual level. You don't need to do much thinking. There's a different race. They're the enemy. Where's the international owning class? The British and German owning class are the enemies of the British and German workers. That doesn't compute for that's only the intellectuals. Interested, taken with a spit with that kind of theory. So now let's look at the economy. So one key point here is the National Socialists. They're both full socialists. Your life belongs to the state. We'll get into that a little more deeply. No individual rights. Your life belongs to the state. The state can kill you for any reason it wants. The National Socialists are National Socialists, and the Communists are international socialists. Now, another distinction here between these two murderous ideologies is that the fascists or the National Socialists generally permit bankers, industrialists, businessmen, farmers, et al. To remain at their work, no longer as owners, but now as servants of the state. So individuals have no rights in any form, including the right to property. They obey the state, or they are replaced and most likely killed. In different terms, private property exists only nominally under fascism or National Socialism. The state fully dictates the use and disposal of all property. So in theory, by permitting experienced producers to remain at their work, fascism seeks to retain in the economy their productive ability. Hence the chilling line attributed to Hitler, quote, why need we trouble to socialize banks and factories? We socialize human beings, unquote. Now that line was attributed to Hitler by Hermann Rauschning in his book, Voice of Destruction. Scholars today believe Rauschning lied about interviewing Hitler. They think he fabricated this. But even so, this captures the essence of what the National Socialists were all about. We nationalize people. We have Herr Schmidt, who's has 20 years of experience running a heavy truck factory, manufacturing trucks. We have Mrs. Schmidt and little Schmitz, in custody, and Herr Schmidt, you manufacture. No, you convert your factory from heavy trucks to tanks, right? Herr Schmidt says, well, if you're right, I really don't want to manufacture tanks. And he says, well, you want your married man, Herr Schmidt? You get it. So you have his expertise in manufacturing heavy trucks or tanks. We've nationalized people. So when Hitler actually said that, and Rauschning may well be lying about, but that's the essence of what the National Socialists did. So now the communists, by contrast, nationalized banks and industries, fighting unremitting class war. They'll murder the owners as exploiters of the working class, seize the farms, the businesses, the factories. They'll place in charge party officials, non-productive party officials, men who are selected for these jobs based on one, party loyalty, and two, knowledge of Marxist, Leninist philosophy. They may not know the first thing about, agriculture or banking or steel manufacturing or whatever. So what then happens, of course, is the agricultural and industrial production in the country plummets. You have party ideologues in charge of agriculture or steel manufacturing or banking or whatever it is, and they don't know the first thing about the business. And so living standards for the civilian population, for millions of innocent victims, drop to starvation levels. So National Socialism is actually more productive in that regard, in that they'll permit the former owners to continue to work in the field, and under threat of their life or the lives of their families. Whereas the communists just kill off the owning class, kill off the people who have the knowledge of how to run the agricultural sector or the various businesses. So The National Socialists wage race war, the Communists wage class war. That's one way I distinguish the two. The National Socialists are race war socialists, the Communists are class war socialists. That's one way to distinguish the two. But the fundamental that unites these two hellish political systems is that in neither does an individual's life belong to him. In both, his life belongs to the state. What moral principle then constrains the totalitarian state in either form from disposing of an individual's life in any manner it deems necessary? None. So Rauschning again ascribes to Hitler perfectly the essence of what National Socialism was all about. He may be lying about the interview, but when he quotes Hitler to quote, "There will be no license, no free space in which an individual belongs to himself. This is National Socialism," unquote. Rauschning may have lied about that, but but he got it right about what the National Socialists actually stand for. Now, it may be even more chilling a presentation of what full socialism is comes from the Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian communists, who, under Pol Pot, in 3.5 years in the late 1970s, murdered 25% of maybe more, 25 to 30% of Cambodia's entire population. 25 to 30% of the country's entire population in 3.5 years. You don't see. I realize how staggering that is. I mean, the numbers are numbing. I know, what these guys do. But the Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian communists, their motto was, they said to their victims, "Losing you is no loss. Keeping you is no specific gain." I mean, you guys see the horror in you. Your life is nothing to us. It means nothing. If you, again, Ayn Rand, who grew up under the Soviets, her first novel, We the Living, some of you probably read it if you haven't, I strongly. Kira Ogrenova, the heroine, she says to Andrei Taganov, the communist, who's an honest guy as far as a KGB officer could be. NKVD, whatever it was back then. She says, I don't remember the exact quote, but she says, you have this life, and it's yours, and it's precious. And there's things that you love, there's things you care about, there's things you want to do with your life. And you see what the communists are saying? It doesn't mean squat to us. It doesn't mean a goddamn thing. You have no value. It's just children. You have no value. The only value you might have is in service to the state. There's no value of your life taken as an individual. I mean, it's just the evil here. It's just horrendous. So, because these two forms of collectivism, both National Socialism and Communism, vehemently deny an individual's right even to his own life, it's eminently predictable that they devolved into history's bloodiest exterminators. So actually, I shouldn't use exterminators. That's what it's bloodiest annihilators of human life. The communists. If you read the Black Book of Communism, you guys familiar with that book? It's written by European Marxists, published by Harvard University Press. The good thing about the Black Book of Communism. Look at it's 800 pages. Look at the subtitle. Crimes, Terror, Repression. Well, that tells us everything we need to know. But it's the great thing about the Black Book of Communism is the authors were able to research in one of the secret police archives of Eastern and Central European communist states, including Bulgaria, where Dr. Dimitrova Clinton is from. And you read the story of the Državna Sigurnost, the Bulgarian KGB, they might even be even worse than the Soviets. But they researched into the actual files of Eastern European and Central European communist states, and to some degree into Soviet archives as well, before the Soviet archives were shut down. So this is information straight from the horse's mouth. This comes right out of secret police archives in communist countries. By conservative estimate, the communists have murdered 100 million innocent civilians. And that's not even counting the people killed in the wars that the communists have started. If you read Rudolf Rommel, and I'm not sure, I don't know, I'm no expert on this, but I like Rommel. He died a few years ago. He was was a libertarian. He was a political science professor at the University of Hawaii. He coined the term democide, murder of the people by various dictatorial regimes. And his book, Death by Government, which you can get from Amazon. This is not cheery reading, but it's important information. Professor Romo goes through, as best he can, the statistics from all these different brutal dictatorships. He estimates that the communist murder count of innocent civilians is much higher than 100 million. They generally, the Black Book of Communism generally claims 20 million civilians murdered by the Soviets. Rommel estimates 60 million. Here's the thing about the Nazi Holocaust deniers. They're generally recognized as cranks. They're not generally taking it seriously intellectually. But the Soviet Holocaust deniers, there's a lot of them are tenured professors of history in American universities. We're talking like leading universities, University of Chicago, Stanford, and you could what's her name? Sheila Fitzgerald is one. I think she was at the University of Chicago. Stalin wasn't such a bad guy. He's just it took some violence to industrialize the backwoods agrarian country. 20 million people, they deny. Now, it could be a few thousand people. The Stalin had to kill. They deny the Soviet, what I call it, the Soviet Holocaust, the Holodomor, the Ukrainian terror famine, like Walter Duranty writing for the New York Times about this. They just deny. They deny it, and they have, and they teach their students as tenured professors of history at major American universities. I wrote an essay on this a few years ago, Socialist Holocaust and its American deniers in the Objective Standard. But what year was that? It was 2013, I think. There's one of these Stalinists at Montclair State University in New Jersey, and there was a libertarian club there, and they brought me in to speak, tell the truth about communism. And so one of my closest friends is an Armenian guy, Arshak Benley, who grew up in Bulgaria, like Nora did. So I cajoled him to come with me, and we advertised he's going to speak. What it was actually like, growing up under the communists in Bulgaria. And then I was going to speak on the nature of communism. I was hoping that this English professor who was a Stalinist would show up, but he didn't. And I'm guessing because somebody was there speaking who actually lived under the communists, he probably didn't want to show up, but he didn't. But we told the truth about the communists. Anyway, this guy gets up in the Q&A. He's elderly. This was maybe 10 years ago, and he's in his let's say he's in his mid-70s. He says, Dr. Bernstein, he says, I grew up in the Soviet Union. My family, Jewish family. He said, my family lost people to both the Nazis and to the communists. He said, I think that 20 million murder count is way too low. And I said, to the best of my knowledge, I think you're right. I think the Soviet murder count is much higher than that. And Mao in China may well be the worst mass murder in history. 70 or 80 million, today is the suspected number for people that Mao murdered in China. You know what? It's interesting. And by the way, my daughter is adopted from China. My ex-wife and I adopted her when she was a baby. Mao who knows? Mao might have killed most of our family, for all I know. But anyhow, this is. There's no way to get exact numbers, but we know that the communists murdered probably well more than 100 million people. Here's an interesting tidbit. One distinction between the National Socialists and the communists. The National Socialists' favored method of mass murder was gas chambers. So that's horrible. I don't know what to think about it. It's horrifying. But the communists' favorite method of mass murder was deliberate man-made starvation. That. The Holodomor, of course, in Ukraine. You know why Ukrainians, you see why Ukrainians, are resisting Russian invasion so ferociously. They know what it's like to be under the thumb, of the Russians, and Putin's a former KGB guy, right? So, yeah, they haven't forgotten. In America, people don't know about the Ukrainian terror famine. We can credit the New York Times for that ignorance, right? They covered Walter Duranty, their Pulitzer Prize winning reporter, their man in Moscow, lied about it, right? He covered it up. And I think the New York Times still claims him as one of their Pulitzer Prize winners. But now also, deliberate man-made famine in China, murdered tens of millions of people. So I don't know what's worse. Maybe, I know we have some mothers here. Can you imagine being a Ukrainian mother? You guys know the rule of threes, right? We can survive 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, and 3 minutes without air. Imagine being a Ukrainian mother. And all the food, Stalin is sent in the Red Army, he's taken all the food out of Ukraine. There's nothing to eat, and cordoned off the area with the troops. And you have 2 young children, let's say, and they say, Mommy, I'm hungry. He's going, oh my God. You're going to have to watch your children starve to death over a period of days or weeks. Makes you think that even the Nazis might have been more humane. 3 minutes in a gas chamber, I don't know. But anyway, that deliberate man-made famine, that's the communists' favorite method of mass murder. So there's a distinction. Okay. So, but so some of the numbers, according to Rommel, the communist murder count is close to 150 million. Black Book of Communism, 100 million. Mao himself is probably 70 or 80 million. Lenin and Stalin close to 60 million. The National Socialists, 21 million is Rommel's best estimate. 5 to 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, of course, and then millions of Slavic peoples, right? Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, that the Nazis considered racial inferiors. Many other. Now the Nazis, the National Socialists, much less time, 1933 to 1945. But the communists had much more time. But anyway. All right, so that is the mass murder count. So, here's another question that Ayn Rand raised in the textbook of Americanism. Are dictatorships efficient? Right, it's a good question. And I answered, absolutely they're efficient at mass murder. Right? Conquest, this is accurate. Conquest, destruction, mass annihilation, these are the tasks at which dictatorships are efficient. So, I mentioned Rudolf Rommel, and his book, Death by Government, is grisly, but I think it's good source material. He devoted decades to researching this grisly topic. He coined the term democide, the murder of the people. Professor Rommel estimated that over 200 million innocent, legally disarmed civilians were murdered by their own governments during the 20th century alone. Now that's broader than just the National Socialists and the Communists, but they're the main perpetrators. I mean, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist regime in China, murdered millions, and then the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, murdered at least 1 million Armenians during the Armenian genocide. There's a lot of brutes here in the world, but the communists and the National Socialists are the two main players here. So, mass murder is what these collectivist dictatorships are good at. So let me raise a further question here. Let's say one of these collectivist regimes, by some fantastic stretch of the imagination, let's say they did desire prosperity. How would they seek to attain it? How would they seek to create prosperity in their country? Now, if you've read Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, she argues brilliantly that this, the rational mind is the source of all values, of all wealth creation. For example, food has to be grown, which requires knowledge of agricultural science, agricultural technology, which requires the mind. Medicines have to be researched and developed, which requires knowledge of biology, biological science, which requires the mind. Buildings, have to be built. They require knowledge of architecture, engineering, mathematics, and so forth, which requires the mind. Every value that human life depends on is a product of the reasoning mind. Ayn Rand argues that brilliantly in Atlas Shrugged. And if you want a different source, Julius Simon, famous American economist, in fact, he was a professor at the University of Maryland, right? As well as University of Illinois. In 1980 or 81, published a terrific book, The Ultimate Resource. And in it, Professor Simon argues that the ultimate resource is not, iron or coal or oil or fertile agricultural lands. The ultimate resource is this, human intelligence. So, I don't know if you ever read Atlas Shrugged, but he's certainly in the same philosophic arena here as Ayn Rand is. And Rand goes on in Atlas Shrugged to point out, well, you raise the question, brilliantly and answer it brilliantly and get a great novel with a real gripping story, mystery story. Does the mind, the creative mind, is capable of making advances in agriculture or medicine or in any field, whatever, in the arts or in the sciences or whatever, will the creative human mind function effectively under any type of social system, or does it require some specific political economic system? And I think to answer that question, we could take a few examples. So what would have happened to Charles Darwin, let's say, if he tried to publish Origin of Species under ISIS? I know it's almost, they would have chopped off his head and burned the book. And similarly, the church during the Dark Ages, and probably the Puritans, as well. What would happen to Ayn Rand if she had stayed in the Soviet Union? And tried to, write and publish Atlas Shrugged, this brilliant novel glorifying individual rights. Well, she would have been dragged off to a gulag, Siberian gulag, slave labor camp with life expectancies measured in terms of months. What would have happened to Friedrich Hayek, the Nobel Prize winning economist, if he tried to return to Austria under the Nazis, under the National Socialists, and argued for free market capitalism and laissez-faire? Well, he would have been dragged off to Auschwitz, and they would have burned his books, and they would have killed him. So you see, under any type of statism, where the state is preeminent and the individual exists to serve the state, your life doesn't belong to you. Your life belongs to the state. And so, these innovative thinkers, if their ideas clash with the state, they're killed, and their books are burned, or and so on. Innovative thinkers require the principle of individual rights. It require political, economic freedom. It require capitalism. And the best historical example of this is late 19th and turn of the 20th century America. The post-13th Amendment in 1865 that ended slavery in this country, especially in the northern states where there were no Jim Crow laws. In the South, because the Jim Crow laws brutally suppressed black Americans. But in the North, the suppression was much less bad. And it's funny, even so, you see some of the great advances, turn of the 20th century America. Some of them, like at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, where Booker T. Washington, ran a brilliant university, and Washington raised a lot of money from northern capitalists to open schools in the Jim Crow South for black children. But George Washington Carver was a revolutionary in the field of agricultural science. This is in Alabama in the turn of the 20th century, even under the most brutal Jim Crow oppression. It's interesting that there's degrees of evil. And as bad as the Jim Crow South was, it wasn't National Socialist Germany. It wasn't the Soviet Union. And dragged Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver and his teachers and students at Tuskegee off to the death camps. Degrees of evil. But anyhow, in the North, you look at the northern states of the United States, probably in the late 19th century, probably the freest period of human history. And you see this outpouring of invention, any field you want to mention, Thomas Edison and the electric lighting system, Alexander Graham Bell and telephone, the Wright brothers, and aviation. If Germany is the land of poets and philosophers, then the United States is the land of inventors and innovators. And it's not just confined to technology. You look at the humanities and the social sciences. I mean, William James pioneers the field of cognitive psychology at Harvard University in the 1880s. He opens the world's first research lab in psychology at Harvard. In 1890, he publishes his massive, groundbreaking two-volume Principles of Psychology. Literature. The United States was a tiny country with a small population. Look at the national body of literature. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, Ralph Waldo Emerson. You can go on and on. Continue into the 20th century with Hemingway, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, and I would argue Ayn Rand, the Russian immigrant who's still underappreciated, that I think wrote the two greatest novels in world literature, Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, which is an assessment I will stand by till the day I die. So you see this outpouring of genius in any field you want to mention. I mean, the birth of the film industry, the birth of the mass publishing industry. Marconi is a European, invents radio, but he comes to America to commercialize it, and of course RCA becomes a forerunner of the birth of television in the United States, and so on and so forth. Now what? The Americans smarter than other people? No. Thinking of that line from Professor Randall, was an Aristotle scholar. Aristotle opens the metaphysics with his line, all men by nature desire to know. And Randall, who was a professor at Columbia, said, if Aristotle had the occasion to teach at an American university, he might have changed his mind. So, no, the Americans aren't smarter than anybody else. But the freedom, the principle of individual rights that was still so operative in the culture in the late 19th and turn of the 20th centuries liberated the best amongst the human race, those who choose to think. The creative minds are liberated to make advances in any field, in any and every field that you can mention. So here's the principle. If your life belongs to you, which is the essence of individual rights, if your life belongs to you, it follows logically that your mind belongs to you. And you are free to think and broadcast your thinking as you will. Guide your life by your own judgment, as long as you don't initiate force or fraud against innocent victims. As Ayn Rand put it very exactly, you govern your life by your own thinking. On the other hand, if your life belongs to the state, which is the essence of National Socialism and Communism, any form of full socialism, if your life belongs to the state, then the only thinking you can do is that which is permitted by the state. And if you clash with the state, if your thinking contradicts the state, then you are in big trouble. You are going to be incarcerated, tortured, exiled if you're lucky, executed, and so on and so forth. But you are not allowed to disagree with the state. So this is why we see the free societies make all these advances that have such great higher levels of prosperity, because they liberate mankind's survival instrument, as Ayn Rand calls it, the rational mind. So, the great minds, we'll wrap this up in just a couple of minutes, we go to Q&A. The great minds that create intellectual and material wealth are independent thinkers. They follow their own judgment, not a dictator's arbitrary decree. Often they conceive of ideas or identify truths previously undreamed of or considered socially unacceptable. For example, Copernicus, Darwin, Pasteur. So for the National Socialists and the Communists, it raised the question, must these great thinkers, take some examples, must the Edisons, the Carnegies, the Shakespeares, the Beethovens, must they truckle before Stalin to receive permission to create? What if the dictator, who's an ideologue and a power luster, after all, not a creative thinker, what if the dictator discerns no merit in the proposal? Will it then be quashed? Would the proud individual and independent minds capable of creative achievements be willing to lick the boots of a tyrant? I'm thinking of Cyrano here. Cyrano going to be willing to lick the boots of the tyrant so that he may write poems? Will they kowtow before authority in order that they might be granted the privilege to think? Related, will such thinkers as great thinkers as these, even if granted state approval to create, will they turn off their minds with the laboratory lights? when their countrymen are brutally enslaved? Will they question only nature seeking its laws, or will they also question the dictator seeking justice? And minds capable of splitting the atom, of revolutionizing the steel industry, of inventing electric light, of writing Macbeth, of composing Beethoven's Ninth, they're also capable of challenging the moral rectitude of the dictator's regime, of raising their voice, of being heard, and of having something to say. What happens then? Well, what happened to Socrates? What happened to Thomas More? What happened to Giordano Bruno and Galileo? What happened to Andrei Sakharov? Nothing good, in case you don't know. They were exiled or tortured or, or killed by the oppressive regime. Power lusters have always known their primordial enemy, the fearlessly independent mind. And they do everything in their power to crush it, to crush the single human attribute necessary to create intellectual material wealth and thereby to sustain human life. This is why dictatorships, preeminently the 20th century and 21st century collectivist regimes, the National Socialists and Communists, this is why dictatorships efficiently wreak mass annihilation, but never remotely approximate capitalism's efficient production of intellectual and material wealth. Thank you.